Big Christmas painting is finished, and in this part we will be painting alstroemeria flowers. Finishing part for this composition, we have alstroemeria flowers. I'm taking my pencil eraser and erasing some outlines that are still visible after first layer was painted. If you are painting transparently, it is possible to erase graphite marks even after applied watercolors, and removing dust with a bigger brush to avoid smudging paper. Let's mix watercolors. I have my watercolor palette, a little bit watercolor mixes from painting amaryllis flower. That's completely fine. You don't need to wash your palette because we can use those colors. Adding Sennelier red for the first mix, Perlin violet, and I want these alstroemerias to be different rather than amaryllis. Adding permanent rose, I want to make these alstroemerias more pink rather than warmer red. A little bit more of permanent rose, testing on a piece of paper, and I have red which is more closer to pink color rather than amaryllis are red and closer to yellow color. For the second mix, I'm adding permanent rose with a touch of Perlin violet for more darker shadow mixes and a little bit more of permanent rose. We can start painting. Taking finer tip brush and first mix, which is Sennelier red, Perlin violet and permanent rose, quite transparent amount of watercolor mixes, and with the very tip of the brush, careful studying reference, I'm going into painting alstroemerias. And as I mentioned, my color for the alstroemerias flowers in this composition in my painting will slightly vary from the reference. I want to make them a little bit different color. In the reference, they look more closer to amaryllis. It looks like they're from the same variety of flowers, but I want to make them different. And as usual, I start from shadow area, painting towards lighter parts. I find it easier to start my first brush strokes from the shadow area. Painting carefully around each petal and leaving those stamens unpainted, and constantly checking reference for little details, for little changes in tonal values. That's how we will build these alstroemeria flowers more realistic. With small and tiny brush strokes, building volume for petals, applying layer after layer, constantly checking the reference, and also comparing each petal and all of the three flower heads. We need to see which is the darkest, which is the lightest. This middle part flower head of alstroemeria is quite turned away from the light source, and most of its parts of its petals are in the shadow. Even those white areas that appear white, they are in the shadow, and later on we will cover them with very light gray mix to make them even white areas a little bit darker. We can't leave them white as it is paper, because compared to other white area, it is darker. The middle part of the petals that I'm applying right now are slightly darker. Each petal has tiny brush strokes, textured lines that we also are applying with tiny brush strokes. Everything here, the work of these petals are very small and tiny. We can't go into super detailed, super textured painting here because these flowers are quite small. But we are doing our best to make these flowers more realistic and more beautiful with each brush stroke. In the beginning it looks more a little bit of a mess, because we are now in the ugly stage of painting these flowers. But we need to just continue with each layer, with each brush stroke, building towards more realistic and more beautiful look. Don't worry about the outcome, just follow the technique, follow the guidance in the references, paint transparently, and everything will work out just fine. It's important to continue even in the place when you feel not so confident and it doesn't look like reference. Don't worry, just keep painting. Don't go with too saturated, too dark watercolor mixes. Don't try to rush things further. Slowly and accurately paint further. I applied tiny brush strokes, and with the same brush I'm washing it and cleaning in paper towel and smoothing the applied layer. The very tip of this petal is slightly darker. Take a look at the reference, notice this little change, and apply it to your painting. The middle part of this flower head, as you can see from the reference, is very dark because everything goes more deeper inside the flower head. Also, that we will build gradually. We are more concentrating on painting petals, adding more watercolor layers, and then we will concentrate more on building contrast and darkness. Leaving white spot on the petal white for now. We will work on it a little bit later. I have the darkest mix still here on my color palette from painting Amaryllis, and I'm loading my brush, the very tip of the brush, with that super dark pearl and violet, and I think Sanalia red was in that mix, and add those beautiful spots that we have on the petals. With the very tip of the brush, look at the reference. One spot is longer, one is shorter, one is fatter, one is thinner, and the more those spots go into the middle part of the flower head, they become smaller and thinner. Take these notions into consideration and apply to your painting. And the importance of not washing your palettes is that you can always use for other painting the watercolors that you have on your color palette. Watercolors can be alive all the time, even if they would stay there for many years. A little touch of water and paint further. That's the beauty of this medium. And don't wash your color palettes. You can have lots of different color palettes for different color tones, for example green mixes, red mixes. You can use old ceramic plates. Be sure that they are white, and it's very nice to have a different plates to use for your watercolor mixes. I started my painting journey with ceramic plates, and now I have my ceramic color palettes, which I also use for different paintings. I have my separate color palette. Applying more watercolor layer to upper part of this petal carefully with tiny brush strokes, pushing watercolors into the white spot of this petal. And I left the white spot from the very first watery layers a little bit wider than it appears in the reference, because I knew that with each brush stroke I will make it a little bit smaller, and I will end up with the same size of the white area as it is in the reference photo. More layers, more smoother layers to this petal. It is still in the shadow. As we look closer, it is turned away from the light source and it's slightly darker than the petals on the right from it. Adding more darker brush strokes to the middle part. And now it's all about looking at reference and adding more and more layers to these petals. Slowly build them more volume, more realism. watercolor layers, still working with the same Alstroemeria flower head that is in the middle. Careful observation, careful brush strokes, more layers, more transparent layers. For this petal, the closer to the middle part of the flower head is darker, and as it goes out, it becomes lighter. In the reference, it's not so easy to tell which petal is lighter, which is darker. The more you will look, the more you will start to notice these changes. In the beginning, I thought that it will be quite hard to separate which is darker, which is lighter, but the more I started to look, the more I zoomed in and studied each petal separately, individually, I noticed the tonal changes. Don't rush things, don't just assume from the further looking at those flowers that something is lighter, something is darker. Careful observation is the key. I'm not placing reference in this video because it is so crucial to look at these flowers really close. If you will have an overall look to the reference, you will not get a right visuals to apply to this painting. And these flowers are tiny in this composition, very close together, and reds are quite tricky with making photos of them. So here is the key element here is not the painting technique, but careful observation of the reference. And I started to add a little bit darker layer to the flower head that is on the right side from the middle one. Moving further with tiny brush strokes. Starting again from the darker area that is in the middle, some shadow areas, and painting further. With the darker watercolor mix, placing beautiful spots on the petal. I'm not adding for these flowers, for these petals, a lot of layers, because this is quite a big composition for realistic watercolor painting, and these flowers are so tiny, so few layers, like maybe we had 5-6 layers of watercolors will do just fine. And more going into detailing quite fast with these flowers, with this composition, because it is slightly different when we have a lot of subjects on one paper, in one composition. If that would be just one flower head of Alstroemeria flower, we would go more into detailing, more into layering. But as they are 3 flower heads and 3 amaryllis and then the evergreen, then with the layering, it is a little bit lesser amount. The attention is spreading on the whole composition, not on individual subject. But if you want to go into really deep realistic watercolor painting, then you need to detail each section, each detail, each petal, each leaf. I am showing you the way, the approach, how you can push yourself a little bit further and paint more. This is the starting point for realistic watercolor painting. Painting further the petals, moving slowly to the next one, careful around stamens of each flower head. But as I saw a little bit later, I could not left the white area for the stamens, because the stamens, the more I started to look in the reference, they are darker than the petals. So we can paint them later, even on the completely painted petals, we can add those stamens later. But this is a nice experience to train your brush strokes, to leave the white area for the stamens with your brush, not using any white color, not using any masking fluid, just your control of your brush. slowly adding shadow areas and darkness to the left side of this flower head. It is slightly darker when it is closer to the middle flower head, and the more righter side is much lighter. With the tiny brush strokes adding layers, moving carefully forward, and still constantly checking reference. This is like the very important thing here. Now let's mix a very light gray color for the white areas on the petal. I'm taking manganese violet, Indian yellow from my color palette, a little bit of red mix, and this color isn't working as it should be. I'm trying to add a little bit more yellow, but I will start different color mix, starting with ultramarine blue and taking from the previous mixed watercolors. And I have a very light, closer to red or pink gray mix, and I'm very transparently applying this watercolor mix to the petals where the white areas, white spots are. We need to tone them down to make them more in the shadow. Even if the white area is in the shadow, it's not anymore white. It looks like from the first when we lay eyes on the reference, we see that those are white spots, but they're not quite white. They are slightly darker, more grayer. And we also have a little bit of green left after painting amaryllis, and I'm adding watercolor mixes of sap green, lemon yellow, and perlin green to those little green areas on the painting. There are little visible alstroemeria leaves, alstroemeria flower leaves in this composition. Adding more perlin green for the darker touch. And careful with the tip of your brush painting those areas. This area is inside in the composition, in the shadow part, and we will gradually make it darker. Moving forward with flower heads. We have watercolor mixes quite a lot on our color palette, and moving forward with tiny brush strokes, building more contrast in the shadow parts, separating petals one from each other, separating flower heads one from each other. Adding shadow to this petal, and we beautifully separating these both petals one from each other. more watercolor layer to this petal. We need to make it a little bit, but gradually darker. Loading my brush with perylene green color, and with this stippling method with the very tip of the brush, I'm adding little dots to the entrance of the stamens. I see in the reference that these entrants are very light but have a green touch in each of these entrants. Taking more of perylene violet from the color palette and painting stamens. And at this point I realized and noticed that the stamens are much darker than the petals. So I'm like painting completely over the white areas and have a darker looking stamens. But still, this is always a very nice way to practice your brushstrokes when you are leaving tiny areas and painting around them. This is a must for brush control. So you will, next time when the stamens are lighter in some subject, you will know how to paint them. And carefully with the very tip of the brush, painting stamens. And adding this darker mix to the very middle part of the flower head, and we are gradually making it more deeper. The inner part looks much deeper further from us, and slowly these flower heads are starting to look more and more realistic, more and more like alstroemeria flowers, with careful and accurate work of your brush and careful studying of the reference. As I am painting alstroemerias, I notice that I need to add a little bit more darkness to the amaryllis flowers, and that is completely okay. Even after finishing, you think that you are finished, but when you are adding another subject, painting different area on your composition, you will notice that some areas that are already painted starting to look lighter compared to the ones you are painting right now. Carefully and gradually, I'm adding perylene violet to the amaryllis flower head, and even more separating, building contrast compared to the amaryllis and alstroemeria flowers. Adding green color to the green area. More watercolor layers to flower heads. Moving to the last flower head, which is on the left. Starting from the darker area, from the shadow area, and slowly going to the lighter parts. With tiny brush strokes painting around stamen, even I know that they are darker, I still want to train my accuracy with brush strokes and leave stamens white as they are. Darker mix of perlin violet to the middle part of the petal, which is much darker than the rest of the petal part. Smoothly covering the rest of the petal. With watercolors, carefully and smoothly, gradually building layers of darker and saturated color of the petals. Inner part of this petal is much darker. Take a look in the reference and you will notice, and the outer part is lighter. Even if it is hard to tell from the first side, carefully looking, the more we look, the more we start to see. Separating petals with a little bit of darkness, carefully with the tip of the brush so we are not disturbing the edges of the lighter petal. With the tip of the brush, adding spots. And also looking at them in the reference, how they are formed, where are they placed, the size of each spot. We are not completely making them as they are in the reference, but we need to notice the movement of those spots. Adding dots to petals that are red, I only noticed that those petals also have dots only after painting for some time. I haven't seen those dots from the first glimpse when I was taking the reference. So the importance of looking in the reference is super crucial. Painting further flower petals, adding more contrast, more shadow, where we see separating petals, noticing these tonal changes in the reference, and with the tiny brush strokes adding that to your painting. At this point that almost all 3 flower heads are finished, I start to look at them as the whole, compare each of one of them with each other, which one is darker, which one is lighter, where I need to add more contrast, some brush strokes, correct edges, and cleaning up the painting that you have. And by cleaning, I mean more accurately painting around edges, making them more crisp, more precise, painting around stamens, separating petals, smoothing the applied layers. Adding more ultramarine blue to my color palette to make again that very pale gray more closer to red and pink color mix by adding watercolors that I have on my color palette mixed together with ultramarine blue. Adding this watercolor mix, very transparent amount of this watercolor mix to the white spots on the petals that are in the shadows. With a very careful applying the very tip of your brush, because the spots that are underneath can be very easily smudged with applying another layer of watercolors, so be very careful, don't overwork one area, slightly cover, then leave it to rest, leave it to dry. If you need more gray watercolor mix in those areas, better to wait till it's completely dry and then again go over. Taking greener mix and painting leaves with few layers, few brush strokes, separating shadows from light areas, adding some tiny details. Painting stamens with a darker pearl and violet mix, carefully with the very tip of the brush. Painting shadow in the inner part of this flower head, which is on the left. Now I'm taking my round synthetic brush and taking more of permanent rose watercolor mix. I want to make these alstroemeria flowers even more pinker to separate them from amaryllis, so that the red of the alstroemerias is different from the amaryllis. It will make composition more interesting rather than I will have in the same color tone as the amaryllis and as the alstroemeria. And with brown synthetic brush, I'm also smoothing the layers underneath, slightly smoothing, not overworking each section, few brush strokes, one layer smoothing and moving to the next area, to the next petal. The amount of watercolors on my brush is very small, very transparent, just enough for smoothing and adding some little bit of extra pink color tone to the petals. a little bit more darker, more saturated brush strokes layer to those petals that are slightly darker, that I need to make a little bit darker, and leaving light area light as it is. Taking finer tip brush and adding more layers, separating petals, adding some final details. Now stepping back, zooming out and looking at the whole composition together, not on the separate subject but together. And I noticed that these areas need a little bit more contrast, a little bit more darkness. I'm taking my round synthetic brush, and with the mix where is a little bit more of Perlin Violet, Sennelier Red, I'm adding another layer of shadows to those areas. In the reference, those areas are much darker. I will not go into such darkness in my painting. We can adjust darkness, but we can build more contrast, but not going into super dark. Also, inner parts of those petals of amaryllis flowers, adding a little bit more darkness. Careful with the edges. Don't go too saturated, just another layer of watercolor mixes. We don't want to make some super big changes at this point, just adjusting details, tonal values, contrast. This is the final part when we are comparing all subjects that we have in composition. And as you notice, the amaryllis flower in my painting are more warmer, richer in red, and the alstroemeria are a bit cooler and more into violet pink color. But both flowers, as amaryllis and alstroemeria, the main pigment is Sennelier Red. But adjusting the extra pigments, for amaryllis we had more yellows, and for alstroemeria we have more pink color. And I see the difference in both flowers. In the reference they're quite the same, but in my painting I wanted to make them slightly different. Now this is the point when we are pushing ourselves a little bit further for more details, for more contrast, for more accuracy in edge lines, separating petals, more details. This is the point where you can paint even days more. But what I suggest you, paint extra 30 minutes, even hour. This is quite a big composition. I always suggest paint extra 20-30 minutes, but when we are painting one subject. In this painting we have quite a lot subjects, so extra hour or 2 hours would be really nice. I have a time limit, time frame in which I am showing you how to paint, how to approach, how to mix, how to add details, but your choice is to push yourself a little bit further, and with each new painting, push yourself a little bit further. You will see improvement. Of course, you can leave it as it is if you are completely satisfied with the result, but see where you can go with a little bit of more work. Individual work, that is important. Without me, only you, your brush, your painting. This was an amazing finish for the 2022. Slightly went into the 2023, but still I consider this painting as the finishing of the 2022, and I'm really happy with the result. I like the composition. I'm really happy that we painted it together. I learned a lot, pushed myself a little bit further. Thank you for watching, thank you for being here, and we are on to the next year, to new possibilities. Thank you for watching, thank you for being here. See you in my next tutorials. Bye bye.